There was a time when the brush of the artist painted with honesty, a time when canvas did not hide the dignity of African nobility, when the rulers of African kingdoms, the descendants of proud dynasties, were rendered with all the majesty that their thrones demanded. But as Europe expanded not only through trade, conquest, and wealth, it also expanded through narrative. It sought not just to control lands, but to reshape perception, to rewrite what the world saw, to remove images that told stories of power that came from dark skin, wisdom rooted in soil long before Europe drew its borders, and royalty that had nothing to do with crowns forged in the cold halls of castles, but in the hearts of people, culture, and memory. And so a great erasure began, slowly, deliberately, and thoroughly. The portraits began to fade, not from time, but from intent. Across Europe, artists were commissioned not merely to record, but to conceal. Black faces were removed from family lines. Royal relatives of African descent were turned pale with every brushstroke. Paintings of Moorish diplomats, African noblemen, and royal intermarriages were covered, altered, or hidden in private galleries. Statues with wide noses and full lips were chipped, reformed, or buried in museum vaults. The goal was not just to whitewash walls, but to whitewash legacy, because history, when altered visually, is more easily accepted emotionally. The eye believes what it sees, and if it never sees Black majesty, it never believes in Black greatness. Centuries of African-European interactions were sanitized. The noble Moors who ruled Spain for over 700 years were reimagined as enemies of culture rather than architects of enlightenment. They brought science, mathematics, art, architecture, and literature to the European continent. Yet when the Renaissance bloomed, it claimed innovation as solely European, ignoring that it had grown from Moorish seeds planted in Andalusian soil. African queens who had once negotiated treaties, led armies, and governed empires were renamed or omitted altogether. Royal genealogies were rewritten. Documents listing African ancestry were hidden in archives. The crowns that once adorned dark foreheads became symbols of a whitened past that Europe preferred to remember. Even the Bible was used to reinforce the illusion. The Magi who visited the Christ child were originally depicted as diverse men, one black, one brown, one white, to represent all nations. Over time, that imagery shifted until only pale faces remained in stained glass and oil-painted worship. This manipulation extended beyond religion, affecting how history was taught, how culture was preserved, and how entire populations saw themselves reflected or erased. In European courts, Black presence was once visible. There were African pages, noblemen, musicians, generals, and diplomats, yet their portraits were cropped or replaced. If they remained, they were pushed into corners of the canvas, their titles removed, their eyes gazing downward, never the focus, never the center. But what happens when a child no longer sees their reflection in the mirror of history? What happens when a royal bloodline is not only erased from narrative, but from memory? That child begins to believe that their greatness is fictional, that royalty was never there, that dignity came from elsewhere. The erasure was not just about history, it was about identity, because the most powerful form of control is not through chains, but through image. If you can reshape what someone sees, you can reshape what they believe. And if you control belief, you control destiny. That is why art was so powerful, and that is why it became a battlefield. Canvases turned into arenas where truth and propaganda collided. The Black king became a servant. The African prince was painted as a pageboy. The queen with Nubian features was retouched until she resembled someone from the north. Museums today still hold these edited truths. Behind every frame, behind every layer of paint, lies a hidden narrative that whispers from beneath the whitewash. A whisper that says, we were here, we ruled, we mattered. But truth has a way of surviving even the harshest winters. It waits patiently beneath the surface. It calls out from the manuscripts, from the tombs, from the hidden archives, from the oral histories passed down from grandmother to child. It lives in the architecture that still bears the marks of Moorish design. It endures in the royal African names that echo through the bloodlines of Europe even if unspoken. It breathes through the resilience of a people who, though denied their reflection, still carry their crown in their soul. There are portraits resurfacing, paintings being restored, scholars now uncovering documentation of black nobility in Britain, France, Portugal, and the Netherlands. The Medici family, one of Europe's most powerful dynasties, had black ancestors. Queen Charlotte of England, wife of King George III, descended from African roots, her features softened in portraits, but undeniable in records. The Black Madonna, worshipped in various regions of Europe, remains a symbol that could not be erased, despite attempts. The more we look, the more we find, and the more we find, the more we remember. But memory is not enough. It must become revelation. It must become conviction. It must become education, because every child, whether born in Ghana, London, Jamaica, Atlanta, Haiti, or Paris, deserves to know that kings once wore their complexion, that queens once bore their nose, that power once spoke with their voice, that their story was never one of originless pain but of displaced royalty. When we restore these stories, we do more than correct the past. We awaken the future. We make room for pride to be planted where shame once lived. We allow identity to stand up where it was once told to bow. To speak truth about black royalty is not to attack anyone. It is to complete the story. It is to fill in what was purposely omitted. It is to shine a light on what was placed in the shadows. For too long, history has been a tale told by the painter, not the subject. And now the subjects are speaking. They are reclaiming the brush. They are unearthing the frames that time and deception tried to hide. They are stepping into galleries, not to admire what is there, but to restore what was removed. This moment we are living in is a moment of revelation, of repair, of restoration. It is the moment where museums must answer questions, where schools must revisit textbooks, where art historians must look again at the eyes in those portraits and ask, whose eyes are these real? Because every time you remove a black royal from a painting, you don't just change art, you change the child who sees it. Every time you deny the ancestry of a queen, you don't just alter genealogy, you silence a lineage. But silence can be broken, and it is breaking now. We are not asking for favors. We are not pleading for inclusion. We are demanding the truth, because truth is not a privilege. It is a right, and when truth walks in, lies flee. When truth rises, distortion fades, and when truth is restored, identity returns. The next generation will no longer wonder if they were ever regal. They will know, they will speak it, they will live it, they will lead from it. Black royalty is not myth, it is not legend, it is not something to be excavated in fragments. It is a living legacy. It is the pulse beneath the soil, the beat in the drum, the rhythm in the tongue, the fire in the eyes of those who refuse to be invisible. It is the story they tried to silence but could never truly bury. Because a story rooted in truth is a story that cannot die. It can be painted over, yet, but beneath every layer the truth remains. And now it is rising. Let the galleries open their doors to correction. Let the textbooks turn their pages to justice. Let the voices that were once excluded now echo through history's halls with thunder. Let the crown return to every brow that forgot it once sat there. And let every canvas that once lied now speak what it always knew, that black royalty was real, present, powerful, and eternal. Because when we restore these images, we do not just change what we see, we change who we become. They were not just women draped in velvet gowns or adorned with diamonds set in gold. They were forces of legacy, mothers of nations, symbols of diplomacy, strength, wisdom, and beauty that defined empires. These were queens whose roots ran deeper than the castles they ruled from. Women of African ancestry whose existence was not a footnote in history, but a foundational truth intentionally obscured across Europe. Paintings have been altered, records selectively published, and royal lineages revised to fit an aesthetic and narrative that upheld one image, pale skin, as a synonym for power. But behind those veils of revisionism lies a trail of truth, rich and undeniable. a trail that traces itself back to the African continent, to the women whose blood once mingled with crowns. When we hear the name Queen Charlotte, we are taught to think of British aristocracy. We are told she was the wife of King George III and the grandmother of Queen Victoria. But what is often silenced is the evidence of her African heritage, passed down from the Portuguese royal line through a black branch of nobility, tracing back to 13th century North African ancestors. Her facial features in early portraits, before they were altered by artists, displayed undeniable African characteristics: broad nose, full lips, deep-set eyes. Contemporary accounts described her appearance with an uncomfortable precision that only confirms what her lineage reveals. Yet as time moved on, her image was softened, her origins downplayed, her identity blurred beneath layers of oil and pigment. She became a queen remembered not for her blood, but for the version of her that Europe preferred the world to see. This same narrative played out across the Mediterranean. In Italy, the powerful Medici dynasty ruled with unmatched influence. Their libraries helped fuel the Renaissance. Their patronage birthed masterworks that changed the direction of art forever. Yet within their lineage lies African descent, descendants of royal African courts brought into European bloodlines through strategic alliances and marriages. These alliances were not rare. Africa, particularly North and East Africa, held diplomatic and economic importance to European powers for centuries. Intermarriages were not only political tools but expressions of respect and recognition. However, as colonial ideologies hardened, the memory of these unions became inconvenient. They were hidden, denied, reframed as myths or irrelevant details. The result was a historical disservice not only to the queens themselves but to the generations that followed, denied the power of seeing themselves in royal robes on palace thrones, shaping the future of continents. The manipulation wasn't only textual, it was deeply visual. Paintings became instruments of suppression. When African blood entered European courts, portraits were painted with deliberate caution. Some features were softened, others entirely erased. Where skin was once described as olive or brown, it was lightened. Where hair was thick and textured, it was stylized or hidden. Over time, artists no longer even attempted to reflect the truth. They painted the story they were paid to protect, that of a homogeneous royalty, free of African lineage, untainted by the truths that challenged supremacy. In this way, art served not just beauty or memory, but propaganda. It became a tool to uphold myths that helped justify empire, colonization, and racism. And yet truth doesn't die beneath layers of silence. It remains encoded in records, hidden in letters, preserved in surviving portraits that slipped through the cracks of censorship. Genealogists have uncovered these royal links. Historians have published evidence of black ancestry in more than a dozen European houses, from Spain to Austria, from Portugal to Germany. In many cases, the black heritage was not hidden in shame at the time. It only became taboo when racial hierarchies were invented to serve colonial motives. Before that, Africa was a respected partner, and African nobility was seen as worthy of alliance and respect. This perception only changed when the wealth of Africa was extracted, when the slave trade turned humanity into commodity, when justification was needed to degrade those who once stood as equals. The result of this centuries-long erasure is not just a distorted past, but a stolen future. Millions of people of African descent grew up believing royalty was something foreign, something they had to imagine rather than inherit. The lie shaped not just education but self-worth. The absence of black queens in history books taught black girls that they came from struggle, but never sovereignty, that they could be strong but never regal, that they could fight but never reign. That lie has lasted too long, but now that tide is shifting. Researchers, artists, educators, and communities are reclaiming the narratives that were buried. We are restoring the faces, the names, the titles, and the dignity that belongs not just to the past, but to the present. Museums are being called to account, archives are being revisited. The truth is being spoken in classrooms, films, books, and lectures, and through it all the image of the Black Queen, once hidden, is rising again. She is not fiction, she is not fantasy, she is history, real, documented, powerful, and safe. Every child, every student, every generation deserves to know that the queens of Europe were not all cut from the same cloth, that among the silk and jewels there was melanin, that the ancestry of empires is broader than ever acknowledged, that royalty is not limited by geography or shape, that the lineage of power runs through Africa just as it does through Europe. The story of the hidden queens of Europe is not about rewriting history, it's about revealing it. And in that revelation, dignity is restored, pride is awakened, and identity finds its mirror again. For when the world sees these queens for who they truly were, we do not only honor them, we honor ourselves. For nearly 7 centuries, a story unfolded in Europe that many have been taught to forget. It was a time when dark-skinned scholars, generals, builders, poets, and rulers shaped the very soil of the continent. They were known as the Moors, North African men and women, deeply rooted in the traditions of science, philosophy, governance, and architecture. They crossed into Spain in 711 AD and forever changed the course of Western civilization. These were not invaders without intellect or soul. They were visionaries who brought libraries to cities that had none, who lit streets with oil lamps when much of Europe sat in darkness, who preserved Greek thought when Europe had let it slip away. They built centers of learning that rivaled anything the world had ever seen. Cordoba, Granada, Seville, cities of refinement, culture, medicine, and invention. But their legacy was not only dismissed, it was deliberately concealed. What should have stood as a towering testament to Black excellence was instead washed away by the tides of conquest and rewritten by those who felt threatened by its brilliance. These African dynasties brought not just military strength, but a reverence for knowledge. In Al-Andalus, a region that covered most of present-day Spain and parts of Portugal, the Moors established universities that welcomed Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. While much of Europe was gripped by ignorance and superstition, they pioneered advancements in astronomy, algebra, chemistry, and medicine. Surgical instruments invented during this period are still recognizable in today's operating room. They cultivated systems of irrigation that made barren lands bloom. They studied the stars, translated Aristotle, and introduced paper mills and navigational tools that would later guide European explorers. Their architecture still stands in places like the Alhambra and the Great Mosque of Cordoba. Ornate stonework, domes, courtyards, and fountains bearing witness to a time when African minds shaped the very essence of European progress. Yet, despite these achievements, the narrative shifted. After nearly 800 years, Christian monarchs reclaimed Spain in a campaign known as the Reconquista. But it wasn't only land they aimed to conquer, it was memory. Churches were erected over mosques, names were changed, books were burned, and art was painted to reflect a sanitized version of history. The Moors, once described with admiration, were recast as savages and outsiders. Their skin color, once a symbol of enlightenment and influence, became a reason for erasure. And so slowly, a wall of silence was built around their contributions. Portraits of Black rulers were removed. Descriptions of their brilliance were rewritten. Children learned of Europe's greatness, but not of the African hands that built its foundation. Generations grew up never knowing that the compass that guided Columbus or the algebra they struggled with in school had African origins in European soil. This wasn't just a forgotten history, it was a stolen identity. To erase the Moors was to rob Black people worldwide of a rightful connection to legacy and leadership. It was to tell a lie that Europe stood alone in its achievements, that it rose on its own, untouched by African influence. But truth has a way of echoing across time. The ruins of palaces, the transcribed texts, the oral traditions passed down in families, they all whisper a different story, one that speaks of kings and queens, of scholars and architects, of dark skin and bright minds who once ruled with wisdom and grace. The term Moor itself became a point of distortion. Originally used to describe North Africans, it later became a catch-all phrase to describe any Black person. Over time, it became so abstracted from its origin that it lost the dignity and precision it once held. But historical records from both African and European sources remain. They speak of rulers like Yusuf ibn Tashfin, who founded Marrakech and brought stability to Spain. They tell of Zorayab, a musician and fashion icon, who introduced the three-course meal and seasonal fashion to Europe. They remember Fatima al-Thifais, a North African woman who established the world's oldest university in Fez, Morocco, an institution that predated Oxford and Cambridge, and directly influenced European scholars. As we look around the world today and try to make sense of division, ignorance, and erasure, we must return to these stories not just as historical curiosities, but as necessary correct. For every child who has been told their people contributed nothing, for every student who has looked at European history and seen no one who looked like them, the story of the Moors is a mirror. It reflects not just a past that was glorious, but a truth that was denied. It shows that the arc of human progress is not white or black, but shared, that the foundations of science, art, and government are not European inventions alone, but gifts passed between civilizations, nurtured in African hands and spread across continents. The Moors did not disappear. Their bloodlines remain. Their influence pulses through the languages we speak, the tools we use, the numbers we count, and the music we play. Their architecture continues to inspire. Their memory, once buried, is being unearthed by those who refuse to accept lies. And in that recovery, something sacred is happening. A new generation is discovering that Black excellence is not new, it is ancient, it is global, it is essential. To know the truth of the Moors is to reclaim a history that empowers. It reminds us that Black people have not just survived history, they've shaped it. They've ruled, taught, healed, and innovated. And even when their stories were buried, their legacy could not be destroyed. That legacy still lives in the stones of Spain, in the spirit of resistance, and in the hearts of those who will never again let history be told without them. They say history is written by the victors, but too often it is painted by those who wish to control how we see the world. Through brush and pigment, marble and canvas, the image of nobility was sculpted not by truth, but by the desire to promote a single narrative. In the grand halls of European palaces, galleries, and chapels, images of kings and queens, saints and scholars, generals and diplomats were presented to the public not as they were, but as they were wanted to be remembered. In this visual theater, Black royal and noble identities were not just ignored, they were meticulously revised, lightened, hidden, or replaced. This erasure wasn't a mere artistic decision, it was a carefully curated campaign to shape the minds of generations, to convince the world that greatness came only in pale tones, and to push African excellence out of the spotlight it had once rightfully owned. In ancient courts and noble houses, Black presence was not uncommon. In fact, African ancestry flowed through many European bloodlines, especially in Portugal, Spain, and Sicily. Centuries of interaction through trade, scholarship, diplomacy, and intermarriage brought people of African descent into positions of influence, power, and prestige. Yet as Europe moved into the age of empire and colonization, that history became an uncomfortable truth. The visual record began to shift. Paintings once accurate in their portrayal of melanin-rich skin were altered over time. Hair was reshaped, lips refined, noses narrowed. Artists, often under royal commissions, were instructed to create portraits that elevated whiteness as the standard of purity, power, and legitimacy. Even when original depictions included features that suggested African heritage, later versions often replaced them with washed-out reinterpretations. The brush became a tool of control, not celebration. It wasn't only the kings and queens who were subject to this artistic revision. Religious figures, too, were reimagined. Early Christian iconography from Ethiopia, Nubia, and parts of Eastern Europe portrayed holy figures with brown or dark skin. In the catacombs of Rome and the early churches of Eastern Orthodoxy, saints, apostles, and even Christ himself were occasionally represented with African features. But as Western European power grew, those images were suppressed. A whitewashed Jesus became standard, and dark-skinned prophets disappeared from the canon. In sculptures and stained glass windows, the divine was drained of diversity. This visual transformation helped reinforce the myth that spiritual purity and moral authority came hand in hand with fair skin. It also stripped African communities of the affirmation that they too were made in the image of the divine. Museums today still carry the evidence of these deliberate omissions. Portraits of aristocrats once believed to be of solely European descent have, through modern research, revealed mixed heritage or African lineage. X-ray technology has even uncovered underpainted layers in some works, showing that earlier versions of these paintings featured darker skin tones, more prominent African features, and symbolic regalia associated with black royalty. These layers were hidden beneath the surface, quite literally painted over in the centuries that followed. It was not that black nobility never existed, it was that their faces were deliberately concealed. Their names were edited out of caption. Their stories were rewritten to align with a new narrative of racial superiority. That erasure caused a rupture that still echoes through modern culture, art, and education. The damage runs deeper than lost visibility. When entire civilizations are denied their reflection in the art that shaped public memory, their contributions to history are questioned. When children grow up visiting museums and never see themselves portrayed with grace, dignity, or power, their potential is unconsciously limited. When students study the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, or even early Christianity and see only pale faces, they are taught to believe that greatness did not include them, but that narrative is not just inaccurate, it is harmful. The truth, though buried, remains. Black diplomats served in royal courts. African generals led armies into battle. Black saints were venerated. African women became queens through marriage, diplomacy, and royal lineage. Their existence was undeniable, their impact profound. Now in the 21st century, a new kind of awakening is happening. Scholars, artists, and historians are peeling back the layers of deceit, restoring what was hidden. Academic institutions are beginning to acknowledge the distortion. Restorers are uncovering details once thought lost. Voices long silenced are being amplified, not as symbols of victimhood, but as examples of unbreakable legacy. Modern artists are creating works that reimagine those lost portraits, reclaiming space for ancestors whose dignity was stolen. The cultural movement to reinsert black nobility into the timeline is not about revenge, it's about truth. It's about healing. It's about reminding the world that history has never belonged to just one group of people. To look at the canvas of Europe and recognize the fingerprints of African brilliance is not to dilute European identity, it's to complete it. The art of Europe is richer, deeper, and more diverse than many have been led to believe. It was built not in isolation but in conversation with Africa, with the Middle East, with Asia. Those interactions shaped the architecture, the fashion, the science, and yes, the images that hang on the walls of palaces and cathedrals. To pretend otherwise is not only dishonest, it is a disservice to the very spirit of creativity and truth that art is meant to preserve. Let the record show that African beauty, strength, and wisdom sat on thrones, shaped diplomacy, inspired movements, and adorned the halls of European history. Let it be known that their erasure was not an accident but a strategy, and let the future be one in which their stories are not only recovered but revealed, because until every child of every shade can walk through a gallery and see a queen or a scholar that looks like them, the picture of history remains incomplete. And we were never meant to live in half-truths. We were meant to know the full brilliance of our collective. They stood once at the center of the frame, noble, dignified, clothed in wealth and wisdom. But over the centuries, the faces of black nobility were slowly pushed to the edge of the canvas. What had been powerful imagery of rulers, philosophers, warriors, and diplomats turned into background symbols, reduced in stature, diminished in presence, and stripped of their meaning. This change was not simply artistic, it was intentional. It reflected a deep reshaping of the collective Western imagination, an effort not only to exclude black greatness from the historical narrative, but to redefine black identity itself. What began as a recognition of shared humanity and leadership descended into a pattern of marginalization. The paint told a lie and the world came to believe it. In early Renaissance art, African individuals were sometimes depicted as kings, noble visitors, or learned scholars. We see them in manuscripts, on church walls, and even in royal court paintings. Not as servants or tokens, but as equals. This reflected a reality that Europeans encountered through centuries of interaction with African empires, trade networks, and diplomatic missions. The Mali Empire, the Kingdom of Benin and Congo, all maintained relations with Europe. Royal envoys traveled. Wealthy Africans were hosted. Portraits were painted. In some instances, black figures were honored with golden robes, crowns, and symbols of wisdom. These weren't just images, they were records of how power and diplomacy once moved across the globe. But that imagery began to shift as colonial expansion surged and the slave trade grew. The European narrative had to change to support the dehumanization of African people. The portrait of equality became uncomfortable. How could a continent enslaving millions also honor their nobility? How could an empire justify its domination while preserving visual proof of black excellence? The answer was to edit. Black figures who once stood alongside royalty were now shown in shadow, made smaller, depicted as pages, attendants, or symbols of exotic wealth. Where there had once been shared space, there now emerged hierarchy, one figure dominant, the other peripheral. Their presence remained, but their power was removed. This visual reduction was not just artistic revision, it reflected a deeper psychological project. Colonial ideology depended on reinforcing superiority through every available medium: maps, literature, sculpture, law, and especially art. The image of the black subject was recalibrated to serve European ego. Painters commissioned by patrons invested in empire began to replicate this hierarchy in their works. Wealthy families would include black children in portraits, not as family but as accessories to show their wealth or global reach. Paintings of saints that had once shown universal salvation now placed African converts at the feet of white missionaries. The message was subtle but clear. Blackness belonged beneath, behind, beside, but never equal. As the transatlantic slave trade intensified, this pattern became standard. Artists were taught to portray black individuals with exaggerated features, unnatural posture, and minimized presence. Many were shown offering gifts, holding objects, or looking up in awe at their white counterparts. Some of these works were praised for their beauty, but few questioned their message. The artistic world began to internalize and normalize an idea that was never true, that black people had no place in leadership, intellect, or refinement. What had begun as a celebration of diverse power became a blueprint for cultural erasure. Yet fragments of the truth remain. In private archives, older versions of portraits still exist. Images that show black nobles with rings on their fingers, scrolls in their hands, and confidence in their eyes. Some works, especially from regions like southern Italy or the Iberian Peninsula, resisted the trend for longer. They show the Moorish knights, the North African scientists, the Ethiopian Christians who visited Europe long before colonialism began. These were not anomalies. They were echoes of a reality the world once knew but chose to forget. A reality where power was shared, where black identity was not confined to servitude or struggle but stood firm in strength and honor. What was lost in this shift was not only the dignity of individuals but the memory of shared history. The child who walks into a museum today and sees blackness only as background, never as sovereign, inherits a legacy that limits their understanding of their people and themselves. The adult who sees no monuments, no oil paintings, no statues celebrating black brilliance in Europe may assume it never existed, but it did. And its absence today is not proof of its non-existence but of its removal. We must now confront the lie that was painted into history. We must seek out the images that remain, listen to the stories they whisper, and elevate them again. Artists today are restoring what was once erased. Historians are pulling back the curtain on centuries of falsehood. The return of these images is not just a cultural revival, it is a restoration of balance. For far too long, the frame was controlled by those who needed to see themselves as alone in greatness. But that illusion is breaking. Every canvas that once told a partial truth must now speak, and every image that once placed black figures in the shadows must now bring them to the light. Because what was altered can be revealed, what was diminished can be restored, and what was made invisible can once again become undeniable. The face of black nobility still belongs at the center because that is where it began. The time has come to place it there again, with clarity, with pride, and with truth.